This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we will discuss Chapter 12, Sports and the Media, Could They Survive Without Each Other? Your hosts are Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. So I'm looking forward to our discussion this morning.
Yeah, me too. I'm something of a media scholar, people tell me. So I thought we could start this episode by connecting back to our discussion in the previous episode about sports and the economy. And one of the things that we said in that last episode was that, or I should say, we use the term neoliberal capitalism to define the economy when we discuss sports and the economy. And I think it's very safe to say that neoliberalism has been profoundly impactful on sport media. So I thought maybe, Jay, you could start us off there and just talk about why neoliberalism, either why or how neoliberalism has been so impactful on sport media.
Well, basically, just to remind our listeners here, neoliberalism is a political and an economic ideology that basically promotes free markets, deregulation, privatization, and minimal state intervention. And when we look at the media generally through history, back 30, 40 years ago, the media had a community-based mandate. They had a public interest mandate. In fact, when I was in graduate school, I worked for one of the faculty members at the University of Notre Dame Sociology Department who was doing constantly community studies that were being used by the local TV networks to create the emphasis in their news. They would focus on social issues. They would make public service announcements. They were definitely community-oriented. And once deregulation occurred, that went by the wayside. And then we had a focus on ratings, a focus on sponsorship and sponsorship dollars, and a focus on basically getting people to consume things. And that's kind of represented in the sport media as well. So the sport media in the past was linked a little bit more closely with community-based issues. And once deregulation occurred, then major corporations started becoming involved. And it was their MO, it was their goals that became important over the goals of the local community and just basically the well-being of the people who were listening to their programming.
Those are really important observations. And I think in particular, well, before I get to the in particular, I think one thing that is important for the listeners to recognize that neoliberal capitalism, it accelerates commodification. And so people refer to it as that right now as an era of hyper commodification. And one of the areas, and that's relevant for our discussion today, is the way in which neoliberalism commodifies culture. So media becomes such an important area or sector of profit making. But I want to go back to one of the things you brought up, Jay, which is deregulation. And this is so key because it's such a central part of neoliberal capitalism, as we discussed in the previous episode. But Jay, can you talk about some of the real, or can you elaborate more on some of the real sociological implications of media deregulation?
Well, the main sociological consequence is that we are now getting most of our information about sport. We're getting televised versions of sport, and we're getting news about sport from a relatively limited number of sources. And so, what's happening in that process is that certain voices are being left out in terms of the coverage of sport, from TV commentary all the way through daily news shows. So, and those voices that are being left out are the ones that you would expect. All the ones that are not white male voices for the most part, and white male voices that are representing the corporations that are paying their salaries. So that's one of the major sociological uh, consequences is that our access to news and sport media generally is limited by the deregulation that has occurred. And now there's kind of a paradox that's developing right now, and that is that there are different platforms now, newsletters, blogs, websites, and others that are being used by individuals or small groups of individuals to provide alternatives. And it is through some of those, not all of them, through some of those that we get more representation. But those are not nearly as widely consumed as the outlets that are owned by major corporations.
So I want to come back to this point about individual producers and small scale producers, but just to like talk a little bit more about the whole deregulation, I want to talk about a study I did. So I started out when I first became an academic was studying college football during the Cold War, the early period of the Cold War, which is really like 1947 to 1964. Those are the dates that most historians give, to be debated. But in any case, something that what excited me about this in the beginning was that I started focusing on the broadcasting of football games, because I grew up in the 1970s. And as you know, Jay, by the 1970s, college football on television was a really big deal. You could expect to watch 2, maybe 3 games every Saturday on television. But of course, logically, we all know there was a time when there was no football on television because, well, in the 19th century, in the very early 20th century, television didn't exist. In the 1970s, the 1930s, when television was first developed, it was not available as a commercial technology because of the Depression, and then the Second World War, right? So there were all these things, but by the 1950s, television was widely accessible, and this is especially in the United States, but in Canada and Europe, Western Europe as well. Television in the 1950s starts to become very widely accessible. Well, anytime you have a new popular technology like television emerging that is a commercial medium, it challenges the existing commercial structure, which had been primarily ticket sales to stadiums and then, some merchandise sales within the stadiums. And in the 1950s, it would have been food and, I'm not sure how much clothing and things of that nature were available in the 1950s in terms of merchandise sale in the stadiums. But that's how schools made their money. And at that time, as now, very large programs, Notre Dame, Michigan, USC, Army, Penn, University of Pennsylvania. These were the big players. And they were able to, and they dominated the collegiate football marketplace. And smaller schools, schools in smaller markets were really losing out because these big programs could buy up, through scholarships, the most talented players, and that just cemented their dominance. Well, then television comes along, and now you have this influx of new money. And so a school like, and again, it's weird to think of the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League college, as a football powerhouse, but in the early 50s, they were. And they were in a large media market that was actually developed at that time. And you got to keep in mind, a lot of the country and a lot of parts of the world in the 1950s early 50s, did not have access to television broadcasting. So Penn had like Notre Dame, had these very lucrative television contracts that the schools signed independently of each other. On the other hand, Oklahoma, which was the biggest powerhouse in collegiate, they were like Alabama was just a couple of years ago in the 1950s. They won back-to-back national championships. I think they went 2.5 seasons without losing a single game. So can you imagine more than a single season strung together without losing a single game? They were a huge powerhouse, but they were in such a small media market, they couldn't sign a lucrative television contract. So they're like, oh my God, we're going to fall behind Notre Dame, Penn, USC in Los Angeles, right? These other powerhouses. So all of these small schools and big schools in small markets got together via the NCAA, and they regulated television broadcasting. And what that did, those regulations, is they put controls over a very chaotic market. And what that does is it allows for more of we'll call these schools firms, because that's essentially what they are. They're independent firms competing over media dollars. It allowed the most number of firms to make the most money. And they had things like revenue sharing and stuff like that you might be familiar with from the NFL and some other leagues. And that allowed collegiate football broadcasting to grow over the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when I came along and started watching. But by the 1980s, this time period that Jay and I have been talking about is like when neoliberal capitalism takes off. At this point, you have schools, ironically, Oklahoma, amongst others, that say, hey, there's this huge market for broadcasting, and these regulations are creating inefficiencies. So we can't maximize our profitability with all of this regulation. And they staged a challenge, and it went to the Supreme Court. And I think the year was 1984. Oklahoma versus NCAA deregulated the broadcast market. And now the NCAA was no longer the clearinghouse negotiating for all of the schools. The schools could form their own leagues not, I was going to say cartels. They are cartels, but
conferences.
I'm sorry.
Conferences?
Yeah, not conferences, but like not coalitions. I'm struggling to find the right word here. But anyway, larger groupings, and they sign contracts with the broadcasters, and they could make a whole lot more money. And the argument for this deregulation was that it would allow for more smaller, local, independent content. And this is always the argument for deregulation, is that you'll get more local content from smaller producers. But what it consistently does is it leads to centralization and larger corporations dominate. And we can see that right now, that larger schools absolutely dominates the collegiate football landscape. And so there are fewer and fewer schools that are going to be the key players, and more schools that are going to be pushed out of the markets. And we can see that too. And Jamie, you probably like to talk about this, consolidation in the media landscape.
Well, that's right. One of the issues here is the purchasing of media rights and the right to cover and broadcast an event. And right now, media rights are driving the majority of revenue in sports. I mean, the Olympics would have a hard time existing, for example, if it were not for the media rights that are paid to broadcast the Olympic events. So, but the same thing applies to college sports. Media rights right now provide them with the majority of their revenue, pay the majority of their bills, and provide them with opportunities to promote themselves. And and who can provide the biggest media bids? You know, you're not going to find an independent organization that is concerned with issues related to representation, the public good, community development, those kinds of issues. It's the major corporations that are focused on profits, and they're the ones that are able to submit the best bids. And so the colleges, by default, in a sense, then become a part of that whole logic of neoliberal capitalism, the market logic. And we can see that in terms of the decisions that are being made by those top schools. You know, they're coming together in groups where they have the most financial power and potential power. So the media rights issue really has led to what you just talked about. It's the consolidation of the organizations that are bringing sport to us.
And can you talk a little bit more about how deregulation led to that consolidation? Because it used to be they were the media landscape, right? The organization of all these different media. There used to be a lot more media companies
Yeah.
decades ago than there are today. And I think it's important for listeners to recognize that was because of regulations. Regulations said one corporation can only own so much of the media spectrum. You know, when I talk about the spectrum, think about like different television channels, different radio stations, different URLs for websites, right? It's how the media spectrum is organized by all these different slots. And only one broadcast could be in one slot at a time. Otherwise, you'd have like multiple broadcasts coming over each other and nobody would hear anything. So the Supreme Court said speech is enhanced by, dividing up the spectrum in this way. And so there used to be regulations that said one corporation could only own so many slots in a given market. And then the deregulation said, no, you can own a whole lot more slots, and then more slots and more slots and more slots. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, Jay.
Yeah, there was a study done by a company called the Free Press. It's a media advocacy group, and what they found was back in 1983, 90% of the U.S. media market in general, we're not just talking about sports here, but the media market in general, was controlled by 50 companies. So that provided quite a bit of diversity, quite a bit of local relevance in terms of what the media companies were interested in. But then by 2011, after 1984 and this deregulation, what happened was that number, 50 companies, had shrunk to 6. And basically, it was Comcast, Disney, News Corp, Viacom, uh, and I can't remember all the six right now, but basically it was those six, and then those six started merging with and acquiring other major players. So now what you have is Disney, ESPN, Time Warner, and who knows what next when it comes to that particular uh, uh, corporate control of the media generally, but media sports in particular.
Yeah. So, and it's really like it's easy to understand. Money becomes, or I should say, finances, money becomes one of the major barriers to entrance into the market. And so, unless you're a corporation of a certain size, you're not going to have access to the market, right? Just think about what the cost of the contracts that you're going to have with, say, the NFL, the NBA, any of the major leagues anywhere in the world is extremely high. So that keeps most out. Plus, the deregulation allows for what Jay was talking about, this consolidation, where, so what was it? Disney, ESPN, Time Warner?
Yeah.
That is one giant conglomerate, one giant media conglomerate. They own so many television stations. They own the studios, television stations, radio stations, newspapers, amusement parks. I mean, you just go down the line, and so much of the information that any one of us gets is coming through Disney, ESPN, Time Warner, which is incredible. But it's kind of interesting to see, and maybe you might speculate, Jay, a little bit on the future, because we saw this consolidation down to six, then down to four players in the media landscape. But now, because of streaming technologies, Amazon is a player in sports media. YouTube is a player in sports media. So, are we going to see now a flowering of lots of different streaming services that'll generate a whole lot more local content?
Well, we're going to see an expansion of streaming in terms of sports coverage for sure. I mean, there's a lot of cord cutting going on. And one of the things that we haven't mentioned explicitly here is that sport has become the most valuable content, media content in the world. And the reason for that is that people want to watch it live. They're in a high emotional state when they watch. They oftentimes watch, as we talked about last time, with friends and family. So they're watching in collective situations where they're more likely to talk about the broadcast, to respond to the commentary. And so what's happening is that the media rights then are escalating. And the only way that even some of these large corporations can make a bid that the NFL would take, uh, or FIFA, or the Olympics, would be to combine with other large corporations. And so that's what we're seeing. I don't think in terms of buying media rights, we're ever going to see an alternative to a large corporation. And obviously, YouTube, owned by Google, and Amazon, being one of the wealthiest corporations in the world, they want to get involved in this because they want to be in touch with as many eyeballs and ears as possible in the world. And they see sport as a way to do that. So when we talk about streaming and the possibility of more diversity, for example, and more diversity in terms of who covers sports and what kinds of issues are talked about, we're talking about news and information. We're not talking about commentary on major sport events. And I haven't done, I'd be interested in a study on this, but how many minutes of commentary do you get during an NFL game when you watch for 3.5 hours and you see 15 minutes of action, maybe, but all of that action and all of the time between plays is filled by commentary. And that commentary is being influenced by the corporations that own them and by the league that has sold their media rights to those corporations. So there's two sources of influence there, but they're basically on the same page. And so what we get is a majority of coverage and commentary in sports coming through the major sport leagues and the corporations that have bought the media rights. And it's only if we're really inquisitive and clever at searching out more independent sources that we come to the blogs, the newsletters, and the websites that are providing alternative voices about the news and information about sport and alternative perspectives.
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things, and then I have a follow-up question for you, Jay. To add to the reasons that you stated for why sport is so popular with the media corporations, on top of everything you said, although the rights are expensive, the production of the content is relatively cheap, right? Because you have these long events. I mean, like an American football game is 3 hours, right? A Formula One race, right? That's what, an hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. A baseball game, they might never end, right? These things, it's like, so if you're a media corporation, a studio, and you have a 24/7 network that you have to produce content for, sport is wonderful because you've got all of this relatively cheap content. You don't have any script writers, and we know that writers go on strike all the time. We know that actors go on strike, but you don't have any actors, right? You have all this relatively cheap content that you're able to produce that's very popular, and then you can also have hours and hours and hours of commentary, which also is relatively cheap. And so, for all of these reasons, right, the sport media is incredibly popular. And doggone it, Jay, I should have taken notes on my own thoughts because I don't recall what my other point and my question was now. I got too excited with that last one, and maybe it'll come back to me. But let's move on anyway, because we're going a little slow. I'm slowing us down because, again, this is one of the things I study, so I get a little too excited. All right, so let's change gears slightly and actually pick up on a point that you had raised earlier. Okay, so one of the really profound impacts of neoliberalism is the rise of new media technologies. As Jay explained in the last episode, that neoliberal capitalism is very technology driven, it's very technology dependent, constantly creates new technologies. So traditional media, and by that I mean both print and electronic, such as television or radio, operates on a one-to-many commercial model, which is to say there's a single broadcaster and they put out a media message to lots and lots and lots of people, a very large audience. And this creates market relations between producers who create content and consumers who pay for the content by sitting through commercial messages. Actually, this just reminded me of my point, but I'll let it go now. Anyways, so my first question here, Jay, is can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that new digital technologies impact the experience of consuming sports?
Yeah, I think that it increases basically the choices. I'm not going to use power, but I'm going to use the word choices that consumers have. And so they can pick and choose in terms of where they're getting their news and information. And the big issue here, though, is that with these blogs, newsletters, websites, there is a need for revenue generation. There's a need for initial investments in terms of establishing the site or the blog or the newsletter, and that takes some money. And now it doesn't take the amount of money that the major corporations have, but it would take maybe the support of a nonprofit. It would take the support of an individual that's interested in providing an alternative set of voices related to sport news and information. So those exist, but the big question is, how are they going to survive over time? And they have to have some kind of a business model. And in some cases, they're going to use the standard influencer model, and they're going to have advertisements in connection with their presentations. The other option is to actually generate revenues more independently. And there's a new site called Togethexer, which has been formed by 4 women athletes, successful athletes, and they are providing a woman's perspective on sports generally. And how they're paying for it is they're actually selling products that promote women's sports along with their own website. So if any of you saw Don Staley as the coach of the University of Connecticut in the final women's NCAA Division I championship, you'll maybe have remembered that she wore a shirt that had a big saying on the front, "Everyone's watching women's sports." Well, Togethexer was the company that put that together. So now you can buy other kinds of merchandise that promotes their site and women's sports generally. So that's their revenue model. Now, there are other revenue models that are going to be developed in the future. The big question is whether the authenticity of the voices that are being represented by that particular site and programming is going to be retained in the process.
One of the things that has struck me is that the sport media landscape has become increasingly privatized. And what I mean by that is, if we go back to the 1950s and the early days of television, the television broadcasting of sports, and they were trying to figure out a revenue model. So if you, again, going back to the from my own research on the college football broadcasting, in the very late 1940s and the first couple of years of the 1950s, a single corporation would sponsor a broadcast. So U.S. Steel sponsored a whole lot of football games at that like late 40s, early 50s period, because they were one of the few corporations large enough to afford to sponsor solely a national broadcast. And then one of the things that happened through all the negotiations that went on over the NCAA's broadcast model is they adopted a regional broadcast model. So the Northeast would get a game, the West Coast would get a game, the South, the Upper Midwest, so on and so forth. And then they could have local sponsors. And so that's when they realized they could have multiple sponsors for every broadcast. And then that becomes the standard, is that you have all of these sponsors. So as a consumer, the cost to you was sitting through commercials. But the games were broadcast on the public spectrum, whether it was ABC, NBC, CBS, or Dumont in the United States, right? All you had to do was turn on the television. If you had rabbit ears or an antenna on your roof, you could watch the broadcast on the public spectrum. You just paid by watching the commercials. Well, then, and we really see this beginning with boxing, is the rise of closed circuit television, and you have to start paying. Now there's a paywall that you have to pay to get through to access the content. And then in the 1980s, with the explosion of cable, now you have to pay for cable in order to access the content. Well, now with all these streaming services, you have to pay for the streaming services, oftentimes on top of the cable, in order to get access to the content. And if you follow NBA basketball, it's pretty hard to watch the games if you don't have cable. So what we've seen is a privatization of the spectrum or of the broadcast, where the content is moved from the public spectrum into a private spectrum. And then even still, you're paying with your eyeballs, because you might pay for the service and get commercials. So then you're paying twice.
Right.
And so you have all this revenue streams coming in part because the media rights are so expensive to get. But also, going back to our previous discussion, one of the things I see with the streaming, this new digital content, we're seeing an expansion, right? Because we went from 50 some different broadcasters down to 6, down to 4, and now we've got a couple more players in there. I think we're gonna see. I mean, Google is gonna buy up more media content. I say media infrastructure. Amazon's gonna buy up more media, and we'll probably get back down to 4 again. We'll see more consolidation. But having said that, let's actually turn and get back to the last point you were making, about people engaging media independently. And this is one of the things that digital media technologies really allow for, is they allow for the birth of, it's a horrible term, the prosumer. On the one, because it used to be there were producers and consumers, sellers, buyers, right? But now you can be a producer of media content, and you can consume your own media content. And that's where this horrible term prosumer comes from, that disrupts that traditional model. So can you talk just more about this, how the digital media technologies disrupt the traditional model, but then also what are some of the limits on the ability for small-time producers to disrupt that model?
Yeah, I'll use an example that you're real familiar with, Jeff. You did skateboarding as you were growing up, and one of the things that I remember about skateboarding is that skateboarders created their own sport media, and they did it on VHS tapes. They basically filmed themselves and their peers skateboarding, and doing various kinds of tricks, all the innovative things that went along with skateboarding. And then they passed those VHS tapes around. People copied them and continued passing them around. And that was a really interesting model, because it was an athlete-controlled production and distribution model. And the problem was that the distribution was very limited as people were passing around VHS tapes. But that particular model is something that has existed within various alternative sports. And I'm wondering whether there couldn't be new leagues that would use that kind of a model. This is difficult to predict, but basically, athletes would be in control of the media coverage of their own sports. Now, that is far out there, and I'm not sure how that would develop, whether it would require some of these athletes who are making tens of millions of dollars a year of playing sport, whether they would maybe fund something like this, create a foundation that would be athlete based. And so that would be one possibility. But it's very difficult for prosumers to have large audiences. And that's partly true because they come through independent sources. Sometimes those sources are not familiar to a number of people. It's very difficult to promote them, provide publicity for them. So we have that model, but it's not providing enough of an alternative to the corporate model to make a big difference when it comes to sport media right now.
I have some bad news for you, Jay. So, you talk about athletes as media producers, creating authentic media. Totally true. And this is like typical in anything in capitalism, that you have this early stage that's like a cottage industry stage, and there's very few barriers to entry into the market. And so lots of people flood in and nobody's making much money. And then the corporations figure out a way to create barriers to entrance so that they can stabilize that market so that profits can be made. Well, if you read the sport management literature on this, you've got sport management faculty theorizing and studying, doing case studies, ways for the sports franchises and leagues to take control of the athlete-generated content, because that word, authenticity, and that's key to marketers, right? Authenticity is so powerful of I'm going to call it a media effect. I'm misusing the term media effects here, but it's an effect that media can create. I won't use the technical term verisimilitude because that needs a whole long explanation. But it creates the appearance of authenticity or fan-generated content. If you're a franchise and you've got a super fan who has a really popular podcast or blog or something like that, and you put them on your payroll, now you have control over the content they're producing, and they will provide the best publicity for you. And this is going to move me on to the next point. This is like the key thing. There is this relationship between sport and media, and we've talked about it already, right? Like in the early days of media, sport provided all of this popular, cheap content to fill the airwaves, whether it was television, radio, well, even before that, newspaper. I mean, it's always been this very, very cheap, popular producer of content that has its own stars. So you don't, as a media company, you don't have to, cultivate celebrity around someone. And so there's this mutually beneficial relationship that's developed between sport and media, where sport produces relatively cheap, popular content. And what the media does is it provides basically free publicity for the leagues, the franchises, basically for sport. It's incredibly powerful. And some folks call this a sport media complex, this intertwined structural relationship between sport and media. These are two entirely separate institutions, but as they've developed over the 20th into the 21st century, they're now inseparable. You can't imagine sport and media as separate institutions anymore. And we get glimpses of this every now and again. And I think about how powerful it is, because sometimes athletes will try to disrupt it. And I'm thinking of when, in 2015, when Marshawn Lynch went to the Super Bowl media day, and he refused to talk to the reporters. And he said, the only thing he would say is, I am only here to not get fined. So he met the letter of the law, because he had previously been fined for not going to the press conferences. And that, of course, became a story. or in 2021 when Naomi Osaka refused to attend the press conferences at the French Open, and you could see the reporters were furious with her because they expect this really cheap, easy access to a celebrity athlete, even though the press conferences are like trash. You don't learn anything from them. The most interesting thing is when a reporter asks a mean question and the athlete breaks down or something like that. But for her own mental health, she said, I'm not going to do this. So maybe you can help us understand, Jay, how this sport media complex as a concept helps us to understand these tense interactions between sport workers, the athletes, and sport owners and the media.
Yeah, I think that the athletes, if they were being honest and talking to us frankly and honestly right now, would say, look, I'm beholding to two sets of uh, organizations, and one of them is the team and the league, and the other is the media organizations that have paid the media rights to cover our events. So I'm controlled in a sense by what I say is going to be controlled by my sensitivity to their power over me and my status within the hierarchy, the power hierarchy of sport and media. So this is one of the reasons that you get so many athletes just giving standard responses at press conferences. And, it's very tedious for them, but what they want to do is they're basically giving the media people there what they want to hear. And they're making the league and the team happy because they're solidifying this media sport relationship, and they're passing on information that sport media relationship wants passed on to all sport consumers. So the athletes feel like they're being totally controlled in that sense. And for somebody like Osaka to say, I'm not going to do the press conference afterwards because she was anticipating the same old questions related to race, related to, her femininity and issues related to her as a woman that were being asked, by the way, from a white male perspective, and which constitutes about 85% of all the journalists who are asking those questions. So she said, I don't want to put up with that. Now, in an individual sport, you have a little bit more discretion than you do in a team sport. But she took a lot of grief for that. And I can't remember if she was fined or if that ended up in a court case. But she took a risk by saying that she wasn't going to be controlled by the sport media complex and field these naive questions that didn't have anything to do with her experience.
You know what I personally think was the worst question she was ever asked in one of those press conferences was when a Japanese reporter asked her to speak in Japanese because she grew up in the United States, even though she has, I think her mom is Japanese, and she took Japanese citizenship. And just by the way, to take Japanese citizenship, you have to renounce any other citizenship. So it's a big deal, but her Japanese is not that good. And that's so, but my point being, the white men don't have a monopoly on douchebaggery. That's a pretty horrible, embarrassing question, and racially charged question that reporter asked her. But no, I completely agree with you, and I want to stay on the issue of actually gender. So, in the 1980s, famous sports sociologist Eric Dunning, he referred to sports as a male preserve, right? And I forget what year that was, 1985 or something. Well, since then, we've seen enormous growth in women's sports, both in terms of participation, but also viewership. The women's final of the 2021 U.S. Open reached more viewers than the men's final did. Uh, Personally, I think they tend to be more interesting characters, and their tennis is, for me, more fun to watch. That's completely subjective. Uh, this year, 2024, the NCAA Women's Basketball Championship outdrew the men's final for the first time. It's a pretty huge deal. However, sports scholars argue that media's coverage of women's sports has not kept up with its popularity. We could also add the quality of the coverage tends to be lower. Uh, how do you make sense of these disparities in the media landscape?
Well, it's just going back to uh, the development of sport in the United States. I use the U.S. as an example here. Sports were based on the values, experiences, and interests of men, of white men at that particular time, and uh, and sport was organized to fit those values, experiences, and interests. So basically, sport was built around a male model, and when women started to play, it was decided that the only people who could commentate on women's events in some kind of a knowledgeable way would be the men who were part of that male-based history of sport. So what happened was that their commentary came right out of the male commentary, did not provide any kind of what I would call a marketing approach to women's sports being unique in some way apart from male sports, and that they had characteristics that were worth watching just as much as the characteristics that existed among male athletes and in male events. Uh, so basically, the women didn't get the kind of coverage that would build, take advantage of any kind of popularity in local areas or particular regions of the country. And so the women's sports grew, but grew so slowly. And now we've seen this explosion of everything from newspaper and website and blog and newsletter and daily news kinds of coverage on the electronic media of women's sports. And I have a list, single spaced, 2.5 pages long now, of all the records, the attendance and the media rating records that have been set over the last 12 months. And the big question is, what's going to happen with all of that popularity? Now, I will say that for the first time in history, we have a woman, Doris Burke, announcing the NBA finals. And she's been around long enough now where people don't even notice in some cases that this is a woman who's making this major breakthrough. So, so as women's sports becomes more popular, we're seeing a slight change in the integration of women into various kinds of broadcast roles and journalism roles that have been denied to them ever since the beginning of sports.
And this really gets to the sort of activist orientation that we're oftentimes advocating for in sports and society. I mean, I think it was like 2021, 2022, somewhere around there, not that long ago. Bill Burr, the comedian, made the joke, it's not his job to be interested in women's sports, which I think is not aged very well. I think his joke has not aged very well, given what happened, but it encapsulates an attitude that a lot of men have towards women's sports. And as you were saying, Jay, because sports was a male preserve, sports broadcasting was a male preserve, and the men that were responsible for broadcasting women's sports, they didn't want to watch women's sports, and they didn't believe that, quote unquote, anybody else wanted to watch women's sports. And really, it's through the persistence, hard work, and outstanding performances of women athletes and women broadcasters, women in the media, that we're really getting much better quality now. And say what you will about Drake. I mean, he did give Doris Burke some serious shout outs a couple of years ago that helped, when man speaks up for a woman, it helps make other men, see her as valuable too. And so we do see these changes, but it's about persistence and intelligent activism
Yeah.
that I think has really brought about these changes. And we are running short of time again, and I want to get on to one more point, but that's related, about coverage. And in the bad old days, TV announcers tended to use very racially stereotypical language when talking about athletes. And then there was a whole bunch of research done by sociologists, communication scholars, that just illustrated how stereotypical that broadcast language was. And one of the things we've seen is in a lot of the sports, the broadcasters have clearly read that literature and become more conscious of the language they use. And as I told you personally, I think a week ago, I think tennis is an exception to that. I think the tennis announcers are remarkably insensitive. But there are ways in which, more subtle ways in which, the racialized language creeps back in. And so maybe you could talk a little bit more about this research on the announcing and how it's impacted the media landscape, and maybe some of the subtle ways we do see racialized language creep back into the coverage.
Yeah. So, like you said, sport media is a male preserve, and that certainly goes to those who are delivering the content for us. And for example, and these data are just a couple of years old, but according to a market research firm, 79% of the announcers for major sport events in the United States, football, basketball, and baseball, are male. 71% are white, and just 18% are Black or Hispanic in those three major sports. So what happens is that those white announcers and journalists may have read the research and may have changed some of their wording, but they are not as culturally in touch with the majority of people that they're interviewing, the majority of the athletes they're interviewing, because they don't have that connection with their experiences unless they've done just one heck of a lot of homework. And so, if I was a major corporation and I really wanted to find out what athletes were thinking in those three sports, the majority of the people I would hire would be Black and Hispanic or Latinx, people who have had the same experiences as the athletes who they're interviewing, or at least they're familiar with those experiences. So what's happening is that we may be hearing more diverse voices every now and then, in terms of the athletes being interviewed, but those voices are being presented within certain kinds of boundaries related to the kinds of questions that are being asked, and how they're based on a set of experiences that don't match their experiences. So then they have to tie in to the white male experience in order to answer the question. And that's one of the things that various underrepresented uh, populations within sports have learned to do. They've learned to take the role of the white announcer. They've learned to take the role of the white journalist and give answers that fit into those particular perspectives. And the corporations that hire the announcers are happy with that. So so basically, we are getting a highly filtered set of responses from athletes when they're being interviewed by a predominantly white male set of journalists and announcers.
You know, and to illustrate what you're talking about, I think that it becomes really clear when those moments of breakdown where athletes don't take on the white male frame or the white male voice, and they're punished for it. So when how like the way in which athletes who lose their tempers get interpreted, when it's a white athlete, they're competitive, they're fierce competitors. When it's a black athlete, well, they're out of control. They're emotionally out of control. And it really speaks to white discomfort with black emotion. Right? We see that. And the way in which journalists for the longest time really, really struggled with the NFL players' protest in response to police violence in black communities. Then so many of them couldn't understand why somebody would disrupt the commercial experience that sport is. Why are you bringing social issues into the fun of these broadcasts? Why are you not respecting the flag, the army, all of these things, or the military, I should say, not just the army, right? When those things were besides the point, at least from the perspective of the protest. They weren't from the perspective of the announcers. And it shows the alignment between the types of personalities overwhelmingly hired to narrate the broadcasts and what the producers assume is their market, a white male market. And so you see this alignment. And so the sport media personalities, right, they're speaking spontaneously, but the things they say are entirely predictable. And they stay on, to a very large degree, they stay on script, or they get fired, like Bob Costas, and never do another football game again because he criticized the NFL and CTE. And so, you know, these are spontaneous, they're reality TV, but they're also highly controlled. And it's these moments of breakdown where those dynamics, I think, become the most clear.
Yeah, when it was Black Lives Matter and, you know, athletes were involved in various kinds of demonstrations, the word went out. And, you know, it was worded differently from one corporation to another, but it was basically shut up and dribble is our mantra here. We don't want to talk about the activism that is going to disrupt the entire ideological foundation on which our profits and our ability to monetize sports rests. So, so that was a formal charge given to journalists and announcers in many cases. And they knew that unless they followed that advice, they were gone, like Costas was gone. So, and that still exists. So there are certain topics that are just off the radar for those people. And that's one of the major problems, by the way, with the televising of women's sports, is that you had white heterosexual males who were providing the initial play-by-play and commentary, and they were coming from a perspective that didn't represent the players in the WNBA, the women's national soccer team, and college women's teams. They didn't represent those players, and they didn't represent the culture of the sport. And so there was this jarring disconnect for a lot of the people who knew something about women's sports and wanted that discussed and talked about as issues. But you couldn't talk about sexuality. You couldn't talk about race. You couldn't talk about other issues that were key in terms of what was going on in women's sports, because the corporations you worked for didn't want you to talk about those things. And besides that, you didn't know anything about it.
You know, Jay, you brought up something that I wish we had time to discuss, because it's something I've done research on, which is after 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, when all these leagues got woke, and all of a sudden they changed their whole tone, and they allowed for social justice messages and all of that stuff. I've written on that, and but I don't think it's a complicated story, and but it illustrates how clever the marketing is in professional and professionalized sport when their messaging got woke, but they did not change one bit how they do business.
Yeah.
So we'll have to save that story for another day.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're at the end of our time. So in the next episode, we're going to discuss Chapter 13, Sports and Politics. Do government and global political processes influence sports? You know what? We'll find a way to talk about, because we're going to talk about the players' protest in the next episode. So
there are some global implications here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll find a way to talk about how the leagues responded and got woke. Well,
right.
We better sign off for now. As always, Jay, thank you so much.
Okay, take care, Jeff. And we hope to have all of you tuning in this week, tuning in next week.